Welcome to the first session of our new series entitled Forming Lay Apostles on the life and work of Joseph Cardine, the founder of the Young Christian Workers Movement. And today's first session is entitled Joseph Cardine and the Origins of the YCW. And we're going to begin with a little bit of background on the life of Cardine. As you can see from the screen, he was born in Schaerbeek, a suburb of Brussels, in the year 1882, the late 19th century, a time when Belgium was going through the peak of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it was already a rich country, believed to be one of the richest countries in the world at that time, partly because of their success in industrializing, also because of their colonies in Africa, Congo, and the future Rwanda. And that was the environment into which Cardine was born. However, his family originally came from Halle, which is 15 kilometres from Brussels, a semi-rural area, which had market gardens on one hand, and Cardine's own father, Henry, had been a market gardener for a while. I think other relatives also. But there were also many factories in the area, particularly textile factories. And actually, his own father, Henry, had begun a small business as a coal trader, providing coal to families for heating purposes and cooking purposes in their homes, while his mum worked as a domestic servant in Brussels, actually, working for, no doubt, bourgeois families with the means to employ servants. So you can see that he really was from possibly not the industrial working class in the sense of working in the factories, but from, let's say, the poorer sections of Belgian society. And of course, he grew up in an area near the factories, and that was his first exposure to the situation of young workers. In particular, we could call them child workers because they started work in those factories at such a young age. Later in life, he often recalled the clatter of wooden clogs, the sound of those children leaving for work early in the morning, pounding the pavement or the cobbles outside the window of his parents' home. And of course, there were many people concerned about that situation and the exploitation that took place. And Pope Leo XIII, who had actually been a nuncio in Belgium, wrote an encyclical on it, a famous encyclical, Rerum Novarum, published in 1891, on the situation of the working class people. And since Henry Cardine was unable to read, young 9-year-old Joseph used to help him. We used to read the document to him. And there were other Catholic leaders and priests who were also concerned by the situation. One in particular was a priest called Adolf Dans. A movie was made about him in 1992, which shows very well the reality of those people working in the factories and the struggle that Dans had trying to defend the rights of those workers against the opposition of many factory owners, including many allegedly good Catholics. And in fact, it was the example of Dans, who was one of the most, who helped Cardine to come to the decision when he was about 13, that he had a vocation to the priesthood. And that led him in 1897 to continuing at school at the minor seminary at Malines. And instead of going out to work along with his fellow schoolmates who had all gone to work in the local factories there. And that in fact led to one of the great shocks and formative experiences of Cardine's life, what he later referred to as the shock of the first holidays, when he returned home and found his former schoolmates, who he'd regarded as more pious than him and even more intelligent than he was. And they'd gone to the factory and they'd become totally alienated from the church, and they wanted nothing to do with him anymore. You can imagine the shock that was for a young 14-year-old, 15-year-old boy who had come home hoping to catch up with his old mates and now found himself excluded from their company. As he said, as he wrote later, it was a knife blow in my heart. And he felt that right to the end of his life, as many people who knew Cardine personally will also say. So that began a search on his part for for the causes of that loss and the corruption that he observed there. And he promised to devote his life to saving those young workers, those child workers, not just on a spiritual level, but also to help save them from that oppression and exploitation that they faced in those factories. And he devoted the rest of his life to that task, never abandoning them, as he often said. Now, it's very interesting at this point of his life. He's still only about 15 years old. And who does he start to read? A French priest, a radical French priest of the first part of the 19th century, Félicité de Lamennais, who had grown up under the French Revolution with all its violence, but also its attempts to introduce a new kind of society based on democracy and liberty. Now, young Lamennais had been educated on the principles of a Swiss philosopher, very well known, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed in direct democracy, who believed in the autonomy of the person, and developed the concept of education based on freedom. And young Lamennais was educated in that system by his uncle. And he soon came to see, after the French monarchy had been restored in 1814, following the Napoleonic period, Lamennais came to see that the monarchy was no longer working. People now rejected the old system, which had depended on an alliance, a traditional alliance between the throne and the altar. The church ruling the spiritual realm on one hand, and the monarchy ruling the secular world on the other hand. Now, Lamennais saw people rejected that old system. There was no turning back. He had to look to the future, and he founded a magazine with that very title in 1830, in which he tried to propose and promote the ideas of God, linking God with this new notion of liberty, freedom of conscience, and also a new vision of the church, which is in fact a very biblical vision of the church as the people of God, with a commitment to the poor, and in particular to the workers who Lamennais saw in those factories, which were already emerging in around the 1830s period in some parts of France, with terrible conditions for those workers. And as he wrote in one of his biblical reflections, reflecting on the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus proclaimed his mission to the poor, and Lamennais asked, "Have the poor heard the good news? Have the broken hearts been healed? Have the blind seen?" And of course, his answer was no. And he said, "I tell you this, Christ is still on the cross, awaiting his apostles. Let them come quickly, because the anguish is great and the eyes are tired of looking to the horizon for the dawn that will announce the beginning of the Lord." Very dramatic words. And these are some of the words that young Cardine himself, 15-year-old boy, read. And you can see the attraction that Lamennais' ideas had for him, looking at his former schoolmates who had become oppressed in those factories. And Cardine certainly and clearly, many of his writings from that age, later as he went on into the seminary, it's very clear the influence of Lamennais on his thinking. And of course, Lamennais was not alone. In fact, it developed what was known at the time as a Lamennais school, with many people involved in it. However, Lamennais gradually became alienated from the church. The Pope had condemned some of his writings, and he eventually found himself not excommunicated from the church, but no longer comfortable in the church, no longer practicing as a priest. Anyway, one of his disciples is a person who's still very well known to us by the name of Frederick Ozanam, the founder of the St. Vincent de Paul Society. And Frederick's own father had been a subscriber to Lamennais' magazine, L'Avenir of the Future. But he was very young. Lamennais was a bit too young to become involved directly Ozanam was a bit too young to become directly involved in Lamennais' circles. Nevertheless, he absorbed many of his ideas, but at the same token, took a distance from Lamennais as he gradually moved further from the church. And in 1848 came another revolution in France. This time it was a worker-led revolution. And it's very interesting to see the role played by Ozanam and his colleagues at that time. Instead of rejecting the revolution, they called for the church to take the side of the workers. In fact, Ozanam came up with the phrase, he expressed the phrase, democracy is the very gospel. If we think of the word democracy from the Greek, demos means people. And allied to this idea of democracy, he also began to reflect on the role of the people in the church. Who are the people in the church? They are the lay people, with the word lay coming from another Greek word, laikos. And Ozanam's own brother had been a priest, and alongside of that, young Frederick started to reflect on, well, if his brother was a priest, what was his specific role as a layperson in the church? And he began to define that in terms of building that change, in helping to reconcile the church in the modern era, bringing Christianity into the workplace where he worked, for example, as a lecturer at the Sorbonne University. However, sadly, he died young before many of these ideas could take root, apart from the fact that he founded the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, which continues to this day. But he became, we could say, fairly disillusioned with what happened in the wake of that 1848 revolution. In fact, most of the church became afraid of, were unable to take the side of the workers. They became afraid, they rejected the revolution. And there was a new, not a monarchy, but a new empire, a second empire was installed in France. And Ozanam, before he died, lamented that the church had lost a huge opportunity in 1848. In fact, it had lost the working class. And this was a tragedy that would continue for generations to come, an idea that also Cardine would reflect on greatly, the loss of the working class to the church in the 19th century. Now, there was a third person who was also another major influence on Cardine, who was actually linked both to Ozanam and to Lamennais. It was another French priest called Alphonse Gratry, born in the north of France in Lille, into a wealthy family who actually owned factories there. He went off to study at the École Polytechnique, a science university in Paris, where he became friends with another guy called Frederick Laplay, a future mining engineer and social reformer. And young Gratry did a doctoral thesis on the scientific method. And both he and Laplay became very aware of the social problems that were emerging. They were also there at the time of the Worker Revolution of 1848. And it was in 1848 that Gratry published his first book, which was a manual on social action, an attempt to get people to see, to respond to the social problems that were becoming very clear at that time. By this time, he'd also become a priest and a philosopher. Robbie, you're shouting. What are you shouting? I asked you not to shout. Oh.